Welcome, everyone. I know we still have some people filtering in, but I'd love to start. We have lots to cover tonight. I'm delighted you're all here. My name is Samantha Harvey. I'm a professor in the English department and the organizer of the Idea of Nature lecture series, which is now in its 5th year, very pleased to say. Thank you. There have been some really exciting developments in the series recently that I'd like to tell you about. I'm delighted to announce that this year we have the beginning of a more formal partnership with the College of Idaho, thanks to a very generous gift by Marv and Lori Henberg and others interested in promoting environmental awareness. We now have an endowed public lecture every year that will bring a speaker both to the College of Idaho and Boise State, which is really just terrific news. Marv Henberg is a former president of the College of Idaho, an environmental philosopher, a Rhodes Scholar, and an ardent supporter of the public humanities and the environment. So tonight's speaker, Ellen Wohl, is officially the first Marv and Lori Henberg lecturer to speak at Boise State. We're very delighted about that. Another exciting development this year is that the Nature Conservancy and the Idaho Conservation League have partnered with the series to create additional events with Idea of Nature speakers in Idaho. So we have an event in Ketchum and another one here in Boise in March. And I want to thank Lisa Eller from the Nature Conservancy and Rick Johnson and Pat Ford at the ICL for their forward-thinking and innovative ideas for collaboration. And I hope this is the first of many collaborations with many different partners. Finally, I'd like to announce that our website has undergone yet another upgrade, necessary in this time to always upgrade the website. And it's now possible to donate directly to the series if you'd like to support future speakers. So there's now a Make a Gift button in an unmistakable glow-in-the-dark Bronco orange at the website, which is scholarworks.boisestate.edu/ideaofnature. And as a reminder, the website also has all of our past lectures archived permanently on it. So it's going to be an archive forever, I hope. And there's also social media links, which I'm told are important. I don't know why. I do have a phone that doesn't open now, though. So this series has been made possible by so many interested partners across the campus as well. In addition to our external sponsors, the series is supported that I've already named. The series is supported by the Idaho Humanities Council, which is a state-based program of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Community partners include the MK Nature Center, the Treasure Valley Food Coalition, the Ketchum Community Library, the Osher Institute, and the Frank Church Institute. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of many units across campus here at Boise State, including the College of Arts and Sciences, the School of Public Service, the College of Education, the College of Innovation and Design, the College of Business, the Department of English, Department of Geosciences, Environmental Studies, and the Hemingway Literary Center. So this is just fabulous to have all of this support across campus. I would also like to thank Maya Dorobtovich for her help in organizing, Jessica Gordon and Brittany O'Meara for publicity, and Michelle Armstrong for maintaining the website. And thank all of you for being here tonight. It's a wonderful audience. Happy to see so many old faces and new faces here. I'm delighted to introduce to you tonight our first Marv and Lori Henberg lecturer, Professor Ellen Wohl. Wohl is a professor in the Department of Geosciences at Colorado State University. She's a fellow of both the Geological Society of America and the American Geophysical Union, and has received many awards, including the Gladys W. Cole Memorial Award and the Kirk Bryan Award from the Geological Society of America, the G.K. Gilbert Award from the Association of American Geographers, the award for outstanding contributions to interdisciplinary water education, research, and outreach from Colorado State. And this brings us to the topic of today's very, very important lecture on a topic that, of course, concerns all of us in Idaho, which is water and rivers. So let's introduce her tonight and welcome her to the stage to talk about messy rivers and healthy rivers. Thank you.
Samantha, thank you very much for coming tonight. So this is a photo of a river in Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. It's in the backcountry, it's kind of hard to access, and it's definitely messy. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is why I think that's a good thing to a certain extent, some level of messiness. This is a natural phenomenon that you see in this photo where it's hard to find the channel, but it is down there. It was a blowdown, so sometimes called a microburst, a very intense wind that occurred the winter before I took this photo and knocked a lot of trees down. But that can be a very good thing for a river. So that's what I'm going to spend the rest of the talk going over. So, idea of nature is critical in a lot of things. It's how we perceive the world, how we ask questions about it, whether as scientists or as less formal observers, how we attempt to manage and manipulate natural systems. So this is from a textbook that was written by a British river ecologist in 1994, and the inside front covers, as you can see, it's about river pollution, and everybody would agree that's not a healthy river. It's pretty grim looking. What I find really interesting was the opposing front cover, and this gets into the idea of nature. It's a very bucolic scene, a boy with his dog and fishing, but when I looked at that, I wasn't all that impressed with this as an opposing image, because the British Isles historically were completely forested. And if you notice, there's one tree and a couple scattered in the background, but it's mostly grasses. It's a very uniform channel, very consistent width. There's some nice meander bends in there, but it's a very uniform water surface. There's no indication, say, of pools or riffles. It's fairly simple along the sides here. There's a little bit of diversity of vegetation, but it's a fairly narrow fringe. So I'm going to come back to this set of images at the end and talk again about the idea of nature, but as a river scientist, when I look at that, I can think of other things I'd rather see on the left side of that pair of images. So that gets into the importance of how we perceive nature and the context of any particular landscape or landform that you're looking at, including a river. And one aspect of perceptions is something that's called the shifting baseline. It was originally developed in connection with marine commercial fisheries, and it's the idea that when you look at the records of catch, the number of fish and the size of the fish declines very noticeably through time. But when people asked commercial fishermen about this phenomenon, they were not aware of it. It was gradual enough that they didn't perceive it on an individual basis. So the reason I mention this concept here is that all of us take what we're used to as normal. So if you grow up in an urban area and all you've ever seen are rivers and concrete, that's what you think of as a river. And that might seem like a very extreme example, but almost all of us, and I definitely would include myself in this, are not really used to seeing a lot of wood in rivers, even if they flow through forests, because we've had more than 2 centuries of wood removal in parts of the US, a little less out here. But we have a long history of removing wood, as an example. So we're not used to seeing it. We don't expect it. We don't think it's part of what should be there. So recognizing how people perceive their environment is critical to, again, the questions we ask and how we manage it. Another key part of the context here is where in the world are you? So what's the environmental context? I'm going to talk about messy rivers where messy is just shorthand for physical complexity, sources of diversity or heterogeneity in rivers. And there are different features that can create that complexity, and they vary with physical location. So if I'm looking at the Boise River here in town, thinking about what it might have looked like before Boise was a developed urban area, I'd expect to see different sources of complexity than I'd see if I were up in the Owihis or the Sawtooths or in the middle of Borneo, for example. So understanding the place you're at and the sources of variability in the rivers becomes very important. And that gets into the question of what is natural, which is not so easy to answer. There are lots of examples in science, including the field I work in river science, where we think we're working in a fairly natural system that humans haven't altered because the alteration was so long ago that everyone's forgotten about it. And then somehow it comes to light and it's a big surprise. Wood removal, as an example. How many of you think of the Mississippi as being clogged with logs to the point where they form wood rafts that could persist for hundreds of years and extend for many miles along the river? Many of the major tributaries of the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Illinois, the Red River in Louisiana, had these features. They were widespread and common, but we don't see them anymore, so we don't think about them, or think about what effect they might have had in the past. So answering what is natural is not easy. And part of that is that natural systems are not static. So it's not like you can imagine some snapshot in the past and say, that's what this river should look like. If you're looking at a river, there are floods, there are droughts, there are fires that cause a lot of sediment to come into the river. There's a certain range of variability that occurs, and the river responds to those varied inputs. And part of trying to understand what's natural is saying, well, how did things vary before humans started altering or manipulating the system? One way to do that is to look for the least altered environments that you can find. And these are sometimes called reference sites or reference conditions. But if I go back to that pair of drawings, and I use England as an example, all of England was once covered in fairly dense forest. So what's my reference site for a river in the Lake District or the Scottish Highlands, which were also forested? There are no more reference sites. So in some parts of the world, and we're lucky here in the western US, there are still reference sites that we can use. But if those aren't present, then we have to try and use other means of understanding what the natural range of variability is. Regardless, though, in terms of answering this question, it becomes really important to understand land use history. Even if it's land use history that in some parts of the world, when agriculture started, it was maybe 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. So what you might call deep time, and understanding land use history that occurred a long time ago. Okay, so what I want to just go through briefly are what I mean by messiness. What are the sources of physical complexity in rivers? Well, one is how the bed of the river changes downstream, and you can have differences in the grain size of the sediment. This particular river is in Rocky Mountain National Park. That's what the RMNP abbreviation is in many of these slides. Mostly this is a very steep river with large boulders and a lot of white water. Here there's a log jam that goes across it. It's created a backwater area, so there's sand and gravel. There's a lot of fine organic material, things like pine cones, pine needles, twigs in there. That's creating variability as you go down that stream. So you can have variability in the sediment size. Bed forms are features that repeat as you go down the river. So pools and riffles, for example. I think everybody can imagine what those look like. Or sand dunes, sand ripples. There's a variety of different types of bed forms, but they're regular undulations in the bed that repeat as you go downstream. In-stream wood is another very important source of variability. So one way to think about all these sources of complexity that I'm going to go through is that they're things that differentiate a natural river from an irrigation canal. And when you design an irrigation canal, all you want to do is get the water downstream efficiently. So it's uniform in width, depth, a very even gradient or rate of downstream drop in elevation. And the more physically complex natural rivers are, the more they deviate from that uniformity. So one source is features on the bed. Second source of complexity is the stream banks, and this can be features like vegetation. This is a picture of very low flow in Connecticut, but you can see there's a big root wad on that tree. It's creating a projection into the channel. There's a little bit of an embayment in the bank on either side. Those are places where during higher flows, there's an obstruction to the flow, so you get some water that separates and you get a nice little eddy. There's lower velocity there, a little bit different than water depth. You can have sediment and fine organic material deposited. One of the importances of the physical complexity is it creates habitat diversity for creatures that live in and along the rivers. Another example here, it doesn't have to be trees, this is obviously grass, but you can see it's an irregular bank. And each of those little embayments is a little bit more diverse habitat. If you're a trout, you might like to spend time in the quiet water there facing this way and waiting for lunch or dinner to come down the current for you. But you can expend less energy if you're in that small embayment. So these sources of this complexity can be things like changes in the vegetation, big boulders like this that are in the bank. There's a variety of things that create irregularities in the banks. Also the form of the channel. So if you drew an imaginary line across the channel and looked at it inside view, this is an aerial view of a channel in Panama. There's a very deep pool here at this bend. There's bedrock along the channel bank. And that blue blob floating in space is supposed to be a cross-section. So it's a deep, narrow section of the channel. You go downstream a short distance and there's this broad riffle that's a wide, shallow cross-section. So the pools and riffles here are creating this difference in the shape of the cross-section. If it's a river that has meander bends, there's differences in the cross-section as you go downstream. Again, things that deviate from a very uniform, consistent channel. And finally, what's sometimes referred to as plan form. It's what you see when you look at a map or an aerial photo of a channel. So it includes the active channel, but also the floodplain on either side. Both of these are along this is the Yukon and one of its tributaries in central Alaska. Big meandering river, There's a place here where that meander is being cut off, a secondary channel is forming, there's another secondary channel here, you can see lots of cutoffs. And if you start looking at the vegetation patterns there, you can see different shades of green, you can see some standing water. This river is moving back and forth from side to side through time across the floodplain. And as it goes, those abandoned channels initially form ponds and lakes. Gradually they fill in with sediment, so it may be more of a marsh environment. Eventually they fill completely with sediment. You have woody vegetation coming in, so there's different types and ages of forests. But this is really a very complex mosaic of smaller environments across that floodplain. And it's generated in this case by the ability of the river to move back and forth, particularly during high flows or floods. So there are these different forms of complexity that occur in natural rivers because the rivers can adjust and they have that range of variability. Okay, so what? So they're messy, but it turns out that that's important for a variety of reasons. One is habitat abundance, so just how much habitat is there in the stream and in the floodplain for plants and animals. The other is the variety or diversity of that habitat. And as an example, this is an underwater photo, not high-tech. I have a very inexpensive point-and-shoot digital camera, but it's waterproof, so I can be on the banks and stick my hands in, and as long as my fingers can take the cold water, and take these photos. So the big yellow arrow is flow direction. Most of the stream has very large material. That's a boulder about this big, say 2 to 3 feet across. But this is the upstream side of a log jam. That's the water surface up there. So in that low velocity area, again, you get this finer sediment settling out, a lot of organic material. That's really nice fish habitat. There's overhead cover, there's lots of areas that can hide from predators. It's also really good habitat for aquatic insects or aquatic invertebrates. There's a diversity of substrate or wood versus sediment that they can live on. And this was one of those nice surprises when I saw the photo after I took it. There's a happy fish enjoying the habitat. So, the big boulder is the dark thing here. There's water coming over the top. These are bubbles on the other side of the water. Again, most of this river has big boulder-sized material. It's a whitewater channel, but this is right upstream of a log jam. So a nice backwater pool that's really good fish habitat. So that's one importance of physical complexity. Second one, using some nice alliteration, resistance and resilience. And resistance in this context means the ability of the river to resist change. And that change could be fire, flood, drought, somebody building a dam on it or taking all the water off for irrigation or other consumptive uses. They can be natural or human disturbances, but a more resistant river responds less to those changes. Resilience refers to the ability of the river to recover after a change. So maybe the 100-year flood comes through, there's a lot of channel change, but a resilient river will actually recover fairly quickly and go back to something similar to the condition it was in prior to the flood. And complexity can help with this. As an example, a different form of complexity. This is associated with beaver dams. So where you have beavers building dams across the channel, that's an obstruction to the flow, just like any other dam. High flow comes along. If the dam withstands the high flow, the water is more likely to go over the channel banks and spread across the floodplain. And the beavers build typically a lot of dams. So this is a view of what's called a beaver meadow. On the eastern side of Rocky Mountain National Park, again, the yellow is the flow direction. You can see areas of standing water. There's lots of channels in there. There are multiple channels that branch and rejoin. The whole environment is very wet. This is a ground view of it. There's channels that come together and go off into the fairly dense willow thickets. That's both a resistant and a resilient environment. As some of you may know, in September 2013, Colorado had a very extreme flood. The roads between my house and my research site here, which is only an hour's drive away, were destroyed temporarily. It was inaccessible, so I was really anxious to see what had happened. As soon as they got the road reopened, I went up here and I stood at the downstream end. There's a road crossing down here, and looked at this beaver meadow, and I couldn't tell there'd been a flood. And that was a pretty traumatic contrast to most other places that were affected by the flood. It wasn't until I started really going in there and poking around that I started to find sediment deposits and some new wood under some of these willow thickets. But in this broad meadow, with all of these obstructions to flow, all the beaver dams and all the multiple paths that the water could take and all of the resistance associated with those dense willow thickets, the flood just spread out, slowed down. At the downstream end of the beaver meadow, the floodwaters reconcentrated, and further downstream there was a lot of channel change. But this was very resistant and resilient to that flood. In contrast, Moraine Park is also in Rocky Mountain National Park, and it used to be a beaver meadow. It has changed fairly dramatically in the last 30 to 40 years, mainly because there are very large numbers of elk in the park. We don't have wolves in Colorado. So the elk don't have any predators. They're in a national park. They're very happy, and they are fruitful in a large sense. So they compete with the beavers for food, and they outcompete the beavers. So the beavers have abandoned many areas of Rocky Mountain National Park. When the beavers go away, the dams aren't maintained, so the dams are breached. The next time a high flow comes along, there's no obstruction in the channel. So instead of the water going overbank across the floodplain and infiltrating and creating multiple channels, it becomes more concentrated in a single channel. There's a lot of energy during high flows. That single channel typically erodes, and as that happens, the whole water table in the valley bottom goes down. So you end up with a fairly dry grassland. And what you're looking at here was there is an area called Fern Lake up this canyon, and there was an illegal campfire there in 2011 that got out of control and created a fairly substantial fire. And it burned into this riparian zone, which I'm quite sure would not have happened if it was still an active beaver meadow. So in this case, the loss of physical complexity associated with the beaver dams reduced the resistance and resilience of this particular site. A third reason that physical complexity is important to stay on the REP, retention. So you think of a river, you think of downstream movement, it's flux, it's water and sediment, other things going downstream. That is the overall tendency. But the more physically complex a river is, the slower some of those fluxes can be. And as an example, on a very small log jam here, you can see sand and gravel and some organic material accumulating above that. If this is a big river with a lot of complexity, that sediment may sit in the floodplain for hundreds to thousands of years. It will eventually go downstream, but it can be retained for a long period of time. In a small channel like this, some of this organic material, that's going to be gone the next snowmelt flood. But ecologists have shown that if you can keep that fine organic material in a pool like this, even for a matter of hours, then the biological community can start to take it up. So microbes, aquatic insects can start to ingest this material, translate it into their tissues that can be eaten by fish, birds, riparian spiders, etc. So having retention on different time scales, maybe it's a matter of hours to days of water that infiltrates into the shallow subsurface, longer periods for sediment, nutrients, or contaminants, can increase the retention of rivers. If you have a physically simple system, more like an irrigation canal, it's not very retentive. It passes things downstream very efficiently. And again, in terms of ecology and the abundance and biodiversity of organisms, being able to retain material like nutrients becomes very important. So one final implication, connectivity. Connectivity refers to how easily or with what level of difficulty materials can move between different parts of either an entire ecosystem or a single feature like a river valley. So when I look at a river like this, I think about how material can move downstream. Downstream is towards the front of the slide in this case. And also how it moves between other parts of that valley bottom. So there's lateral connectivity between the channel and the adjacent valley bottom and floodplain. There's water and sediment going downstream, but of course there's a variety of organisms that move upstream during different parts of their life cycle. There's also vertical connectivity. There's things coming in from the atmosphere, precipitation, for example. There's aquatic insects that are emerging from the water for the adult winged phase of their life. And there's vertical connectivity with the subsurface. So you can have water that goes into the shallow sediment right below the channel, may flow downstream for a short distance and then reemerge. And that exchange can be very important in terms of microbes being able to take up nutrients or the chemistry and temperature of the water. That exchange is facilitated by physical complexity. So if you have a beaver dam, a log jam, or even a very large boulder in the channel, that can force that local flow into the bed, and then you have upwelling again downstream of that. So complexity can either increase or decrease connectivity. If there was a beaver dam across here, that would be decreasing the connectivity downstream, but it would increase the connectivity with the sides, with the floodplain, and with that vertical section. So it's not that connectivity is necessarily good or bad. There are different forms of it, but complexity or messiness definitely influences connectivity. Okay, so all these different sources of complexity and the different reasons that it's important. What I'm referring to as mountain river metamorphosis here is dramatic changes that have occurred. And I'm using mountain rivers in Rocky Mountain National Park because that's where I do a lot of my research. But everything I say applies to any rivers, from the mountain rivers here to the Mississippi, the Amazon, the Congo. The details would be different, but the basic idea is very similar. Much of what human activity results in is simplifying rivers and making them more uniform and homogeneous. In these mountain rivers that I look at in Rocky Mountain National Park, a lot of the complexity is associated with these channel spanning obstructions. So they can be log jams, they can be beaver dams, but those are very effective at forcing overbank flow, creating multiple channels, forcing flow into the bed, and retaining material that moves downstream. This is going to be a busy slide, but we'll just go through it step by step. As an example of how this happens, you have a tree that falls into a channel. Here says whether anyone hears it or not. One thing that can happen is it forms a ramp. So a portion of the tree is above the highest flow. Maybe it's still anchored by the ripline. That's very hard to move in a small channel. So that's like the gatekeeper. Any other small wood coming downstream gets trapped, and you can form a log jam. But what happens then really depends on where that log jam is. So on one side of this threshold, if you're in a fairly steep, narrow valley, big flood comes along, say the annual snowmelt peak, there's a lot of hydraulic force that builds up on the upstream side of that jam, and the jam typically doesn't last very long. I've been monitoring my large set of friends, a population of about 400 jams in Rocky Mountain National Park for the last few years, and I'm finding that in locations like this, where there's no floodplain, most of the jams last less than a decade. So it's a very local effect. There's a small backwater. The jam itself is transient, and the changes are fairly simple. It's right in the vicinity of the jam. Other jams form. There's not necessarily a net loss, but individual jams are very transient. On the other side of this, on the other side of the threshold, if you're in a wide, low gradient valley, you form the same log jam, but if it's a lower gradient, the backwater goes farther upstream. If there's a floodplain on either side, when you have a large flood come along, instead of just simply exerting a lot more force against the jam, the floodplain's like a safety valve. Some of the water goes overbank and spreads across the valley bottom. It can help to erode the bank, create that overbank flow that starts to form secondary channels, so you can have this complex network of branching and rejoining channels. There's erosion along those channels, so they're undermining trees that fall into the channel, so recruiting wood. And again, the fact that the floodplain is a safety valve, big floods aren't as effective at removing these jams, so they tend to be more persistent. So you've got this more extensive effect across the entire valley bottom. It's a very stable system. Once you start to divert the flow across the floodplain and form more log jams, it tends to stay in that configuration, and it's a very complex environment. Again, beaver meadows or beaver dams do the same thing. An active beaver meadow up here. This, despite the name, the proper geographic name is Upper Beaver Meadows. That's what it's called on the park maps, and it's Beaver Brook, but there are no beavers there now. They haven't been there since the 1970s. So this is what Upper Beaver Brook looks like. It's cut down into the floodplain. The floodplain is much drier. There's not really any of those nice woody riparian willows. There's been very heavy grazing by elk. So there's been a big change as a result of losing that complexity. And another illustration of this, I showed you Moraine Park before. That was the area that burned. You can see there's 1964, the flow is going from left to right here. So there's multiple channels across this very broad valley bottom. By 1987, there's this one main channel, and there's still a secondary channel. But today, and I'll come back to those numbers on the margin in a minute, this is what it looks like today. It's one of the iconic views in Rocky Mountain National Park. It's a very beautiful place. But when I look at it, knowing the land use history, I say, well, it's not that natural a system. There's been the removal of the beaver through competition with the elk. There's very heavy overgrazing. We've gone to a much simpler single channel without the same riparian vegetation. If I go back for a minute and look at these numbers, these are populations of the two animals in Rocky Mountain National Park through time. So in 1940, there were 315 beaver. By 1999, they were down to 6, and that's about what the population is today. And the elk, this dip is the Park Service periodically goes through various elk control strategies. If you go to Rocky Mountain and you see a lot of elk that look like they had car accidents, they've got these orthopedic collars. Those are contraceptive collars, so that's what they're doing now. So they're trying to keep the numbers down, but it's a the two curves are like this. So elk numbers go up, beaver numbers go down. And the park is actively undertaking riparian restoration, mainly in the form of big grazing fences, trying to keep the elk out of the valley bottoms. But there's been this dramatic change, indirectly as a result of human activities, in this case hunting predators to extinction back in the 1920s. So, if you have log jams or beaver dams, these sources of obstruction, you have all these secondary effects. The overbank floods, a lot of that infiltrates, so you have a very wet valley bottom. The water and the nutrients are going back and forth between the channel and the immediate shallow area below it. The channels are very physically complex. You're storing a lot of fine sediment that otherwise goes downstream. Nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon are stored with that fine sediment, and that really fosters a much greater diversity of species. And the nutrient storage in particular, I just want to touch on for a moment, because I know this is not an audience that would say, well, I don't care about biodiversity, but some people might. So what does it matter if, let's ignore biodiversity for a moment, why else is it important to store nutrients? Well, one of the things that is trapped very effectively in an area like this is organic carbon. If it's not there, you have more dissolved organic carbon in the water. And dissolved organic carbon doesn't hurt you at all, but it creates odor and taste in water. These are the drinking water sources for the almost 5 million people now who live at the base of the Colorado Front Range. And if the water is a little bit discolored or smells a little off, people don't like it, so we treat it with chlorine. Chlorine reacts with dissolved organic carbon to create trihalomethanes. It's a group of chemical compounds that are carcinogens. So you don't want to have dissolved organic carbon in the water. You want to minimize the amount of chlorine that you have to put in. If you can maintain complexity in the headwaters, that's a really good way to reduce dissolved organic carbon downstream. So one example of why it matters on a very immediate human timescale. So one of the things that we've seen in Rocky Mountain National Park, especially with the beavers, but in rivers around the world, is that the net effect of human activities is to simplify and homogenize rivers. We take wood out, we trap beavers, we regulate the flow, we build artificial levees. There's a variety of things that we do. We dredge, channelize rivers. But as you lose that physical complexity, they go through this metamorphosis where they become more simple and uniform. And I sometimes refer to them as leaky rivers because instead of retaining fine sediment, organic matter, nutrients, that material gets flushed downstream more quickly. And in extreme examples, we see this as a very severe problem of eutrophication in coastal areas. The Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico are the most famous example, but many of our rivers have eutrophication areas where there's excess nutrients that accumulate in the near shore, and that leads to blue-green algal blooms. When those organisms die, it reduces the level of dissolved oxygen in the water, and then a lot of other organisms can't survive either. So by making our rivers more like pipes that transmit things very quickly downstream, by making them simpler and more uniform, we've created a lot of unfortunate and unintended downstream effects. So some of the evidence that we've been looking at that messy or physically complex equals healthy, these are work that is being done by different graduate students I work with. So Nick Supfin just finished his PhD, and he was looking at organic carbon storage in valley bottom sediments. And this is going to look, again, complex, but I'll walk you through it. This is units of carbon per surface area of the valley bottom, so megagrams of carbon per hectare. Each of these bars is a different valley segment, and the orange part is downed dead wood, the green is the living vegetation, the gray is below ground storage of carbon in the sediment. The first 4 bars are these wide, shallow, low gradient valley sections. These are what you might think of as classic mountain rivers. They're very steep and narrow. So one of the key things that we found is that not all parts of a river network are equally important in terms of creating complexity, biodiversity, and habitat and retention. These wide, low gradient sections store a disproportionate amount of organic carbon, using that as one indicator. They make up less than a quarter of the total length of rivers in these headwater mountain networks, but they store about 3/4 of the carbon. And they store almost a quarter of the carbon that's in the entire watershed, even though they're a very small part of the watershed. So rivers really can be hotspots of a variety of things, including organic carbon storage, and specific portions of the river network can be hotspots within that greater river network. Second line of evidence, Bridget Livers is just finishing her PhD. We were looking at, again, physical complexity and carbon storage within the active channel. mainly in the form of wood and very fine organic material like pine cones, leaves, leaf litter. This is part of a big group where we've got people looking at what's called stream metabolism, which is just how effectively does a stream retain things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon, and then looking at how that translates into animal tissue. So how many fish, how many insects, how many riparian spiders do you have? And the short version of this, the more physically complex, the more you're storing fine organic matter and organic carbon, and that typically translates with old-growth forest. Old-growth forest is big trees, so long, broad, they fall into the channel. It's pretty hard for them to move in these small rivers, so they're very effective at creating log jams that trap other materials. That translates to more nutrient uptake, particularly nitrogen, and I always hate saying this because it's embarrassing for all of us as a society, but Rocky Mountain National Park, this really beautiful area, the rivers are severely polluted because of nitrogen inputs from the atmosphere. So they're nitrogen overloaded. So anything you can do to slow that downstream movement of nitrogen by creating complexity and allowing organisms to process it is very good for water quality. So we find greater nitrogen uptake in these physically complex channels, and we find a lot more abundance of organisms and diversity. And we thought we'd find more aquatic insects. We were a little puzzled when we didn't, but then we realized it's because they're all getting eaten so efficiently. So there's a lot more trout, and there's a lot more riparian spiders. And as an example of this, Adam Herdrick is another graduate student working on this. I'm sorry this is getting cut off, but it's number of fish per unit area of channel. When you have a low wood load, there's not nearly as much habitat, you don't have as many fish. High wood load, a lot more fish. And most of our complex sites with old-growth forest are in higher elevations where, because of temperature limits, you'd expect to actually have lower numbers of fish because it's harder for them to grow big. But despite that, even though it's higher elevation and colder, they do really well if there's a lot of wood. So third line of evidence, coming back to those beaver meadows, this is Deanna Laurel's PhD work that she's just starting. We're looking at the rate at which the flood pulse, or the seasonal snowmelt flood, moves downstream through beaver meadows that are active versus those that are abandoned. This is an abandoned dam. That's the flow direction. You're looking through a cross-section of dam. You may be able to see some of the buried wood. We have a lot of abandoned beaver meadows in Rocky Mountain National Park to work with. And as you might expect, once the beavers leave and the dams fall into disrepair, the beaver meadows are much less effective at creating complexity. They do still attenuate these downstream fluxes of a variety of materials, but the carbon storage goes way down. Carbon in the form of organic material is stored very effectively in sediment if that sediment is wet. That limits microbial activity. If the beavers are there maintaining their dams, the whole valley bottom is wet. When the valley bottom dries out, we go from something like 23% of the total carbon storage to less than 10%. So put this all in a historical context. Rocky Mountain National Park is not unique by any means. I emphasized old-growth forest. You have bigger trees, larger wood, more log jams, more physical complexity. Globally, we have minimal old-growth forest left. And we've reduced forest cover by about half of its maximum extent during the Holocene, or the last 10,000 years of geologic time, as well as nearly eliminating old growth. If you look at beavers as an example, actually, I should probably revise this. I think some of the estimates now, there might have been 400 million beaver in North America, but it's 6 to 12 million now. So they're not in danger of extinction, but if you could magically travel back in time, say to 1600, it would be a very different landscape. An awful lot of rivers would just be a stair-step of ponds with beaver dams in between them in forested regions. And a lot of rivers would have had many, many log jams compared to today. Similarly, in Europe, castor fiber is the European beaver. They're just getting up to 1 million, but probably historically they were present everywhere in Eurasia, from China to the Pyrenees. So probably more than 200 million historically. And again, coming back to the microcosm of Rocky Mountain National Park, where there are something like 5 or 6 beavers today, there's a place that I mentioned before, the official name is Upper Beaver Meadows. They're not there now, but we've used ground-penetrating radar to look into the subsurface. We know what buried beaver dams and beaver pond sediments look like, and we estimate that those beaver dams, over the last 15,000 years of geologic history, have trapped about half the sediment that's present in this meadow. So when the beaver dams are present, they're very effective at attenuating some of these downstream fluxes. So one way to think about this in terms of messy versus simple rivers is a concept from ecology of alternative stable states. And it's the idea that you could take any river segment and there are at least two potential possibilities, either of which is quite stable and persistent, but they're very different. And you go between those through some type of disturbance. So an example, highly technical terms here, wood rich and wood poor. In a completely natural setting, the amount of wood coming into a channel varies. There are landslides, there are forest fires, blowdowns, whatever it may be. So sometimes you have a lot of wood coming in, sometimes not much. But there's typically always some. And if there's some, then it can trap other wood. So the wood, the channel, unless the debris flow goes right down, it usually doesn't become completely free of wood. Most of what we do in forested regions is take all the wood out, whether it's for timber harvest, navigation, flood control. There are a variety of reasons we've done this. But then, even if we stop taking the wood out, and that tree is about to fall into the channel there's not so much to trap it. That's a fairly uniform channel, and there's not many obstructions. There's no big log jam that's going to catch it. So once you take all the wood out, it takes a while to go back, like a couple hundred years at least, to go back to a wood-rich state. So there's these two alternatives that can persist. The other example, and I've alluded to this before, if you have the beaver dams present, you have this wet meadow environment that's called a beaver meadow. Ecologists have called the alternate where the beavers disappear, the dams fall into disrepair, flow concentrates in one channel, cuts down, the whole thing gets drier. It's referred to as an elk grassland. And the term originally came out of Yellowstone and other places in the western U.S. Now, if the Rocky Mountain wants to restore this area, they can't just drop off a pair of happy beavers and say, be fruitful and multiply. There's nothing for them to eat. I mean, they can't eat grasses, but they really need woody vegetation. So it's not a simple matter to go back from one of these alternative stable states to the other. They're doing things like putting in the grazing enclosures to allow the woody vegetation to recover. So how much messiness is good? And I couldn't resist, this is a pun on Dumb and Dumber. There's messy and there's messier, and it gets back to what I talked about originally with environmental context. Where you are in the world determines the sources of complexity and the levels of complexity that are approximating a natural state. But the land use history there will also constrain what's feasible. And one thing I think that's really important with any kind of environmental restoration, including river restoration, is that it's not all or nothing. We're not going to take the Boise River back to what it was like 300 years ago, but that doesn't mean there's not a lot that can be restored on a river going through an urban area. So understanding what has happened to change it in the past in terms of land use history and how that continuing land use might constrain future management becomes very important. And just to bring the point home, 3 very different environments, Sardinia, Borneo, Colorado. Those are all natural rivers. They have different levels and different sources of complexity, but you can't use one as a template for the other. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach to understanding physical complexity or using it in restoration. And the last of these, hopefully doesn't look too intimidating graphs, but again, I'll go through it. So just length scale from something that's very small up to something the size of an entire watershed or drainage basin. Time scale from essentially instantaneous to very long times. This is another way of presenting what I started this talk with, the different forms of complexity in rivers. So if you have a sandbed stream, you can have ripples, dunes, or the sand sheeting along. You can have differences in the width and the depth of the channel, maybe pools and riffles and gravel bed, up to, is this a channel that's fairly steep in its headwaters and then goes lower gradient as you go downstream, or does it have a series of waterfalls? So the big profile gradient. And at the large time and space scales, those are the long-acting natural processes like geology, tectonic uplift, climate will shape that. What we as humans do is mostly at these intermediate to shorter scales, so both land use and then direct river engineering in the channel, things like flow regulation, channelization, dredging, really act to alter these. And again, the net effect is typically that we dramatically reduce physical complexity. There's different reasons for that. Some of them are aesthetic. People don't like rivers that look messy. Many times it's much more utilitarian. You want the river to be efficient at conveying floodwaters downstream. You don't want overnight flooding. So you dredge it or you straighten it. We've got lots of examples of channelization and straightening. But keeping this in mind and coming back to that pair of drawings, so again, the idea of nature, many of us would look at this and say, well, that's a really nice, natural, very attractive looking river. But I asked one of our grad students who's a good artist to do a slight revisioning of this. So here we've got the boy actually catching a fish. So the dog didn't make it in, I don't know why, she does like dogs, but there's a little more complexity in here. So we've got riparian trees, and some of them are very young, so there's a diversity of age. There's some wood in the channel, it's hard to see, so I highlighted that there's a little secondary channel cutting off that point bar. There's a little more diversity along the margins of the river in terms of the vegetation, and you can see there's pools and riffles, so that's getting more towards what I think of as a healthy river. And it's hard to overemphasize how important human perceptions and the idea of nature is, because as scientists, we can think we know what's going on with these systems, but if it doesn't go beyond the scientific community, it doesn't have that much influence. What really matters is how the society as a whole, whatever society that may be, interacts with any natural environment, including rivers, because that's how we manage them and how we perceive them and how we say, oh, this is not healthy, we need to fix things, or no, looks fine to me, we're good to go. So with that, thank you.
Check back in March 17th and April 14th. I hope I'll see some of you back there.